Hey everyone, thanks a lot for coming. I'm Vishal, one of the co-founders of Stride Labs and a core contributor to the Stride protocol. We're going to be talking today about how sovereign rollups actually work. I've seen a lot of disagreement online, on Twitter or forums, etc., around like what sovereign rollups are. Is it really just a vibe? They differ from ETH-L2s. How far can you really push definition of a sovereign rollup? And I myself really did not really know what a sovereign rollup was and how it differed from L2. And I want to use this as an opportunity to kind of tell you all about what sovereign rollups are. And I think they are a really novel way of operating a blockchain. So let's get into it. So this talk is going to be inspired by a talk given by Kevin Fichter, from Optimism on YouTube. Would highly recommend checking it out. I think it's one of the best talks I've seen, not only in crypto, but just in general. It's on YouTube. It's called How Rollups Actually Work by Kelvin. Highly recommend. So this talk is going to be kind of like building off that / inspired by it. I want to say I really did not know what a sovereign rollup was. I thought I did. I did not. I imagine it's true for maybe some of you in the room here, some of us in like the world in general. And hopefully by the end of this talk, it's going to be more clear. So start off maybe like a guiding question. Is Venmo a sovereign rollup? I'm curious, do you all, show of hands, who here thinks Venmo is a sovereign rollup? All right, we got some. Who thinks it is not a sovereign rollup? All right, yeah, we got some hands on both directions, a lot of undecideds. Well, we'll see where it goes. So maybe to start off, let's talk about how rollups work in general. And some of this might be familiar to you, but I think it's helpful to set the stage on just what the general map is of a rollup. So let's start off with a smart contract rollup, which I think is the most common type, like something like Base or Optimism, all of those. So you start off, you have like your normal L2. You know, you got like your network here, you got your like blockchain. It's not that useful, just a blockchain. So we tend to have some apps as well. So we have like, you know, Uniswap, Friendtech, whatever, you got some apps. But right now there's just a blockchain, like this isn't really an L2, it's just kind of functioning by itself. So what actually makes it secure? You have Ethereum and you have this big old bridge connecting you to Ethereum. This is really critical for an L2. This bridge handles basically everything that's important on this blockchain. In particular, all the transactions in the blockchain end up going through this bridge at some point. And so it's really important that the bridge is able to communicate down to Ethereum what's going on this blockchain. And then in particular, we tend to have some sort of like guard dog or something on the bridge that verifies all the transactions going through the bridge are proper or valid. You know, there are two different kinds of guard dogs in this bridge. There's like a ZK guard dog, there's optimistic guard dogs, maybe other types of like guard dogs in the future, but it's really important that this bridge is very secure. But this isn't really the whole picture of a rollup. You also have like users, and how do users interact with the rollup? So imagine you have like all these little MetaMasks over here, all these little users. They tend to, you know, they have transactions they want to submit. They're like, maybe they want to buy an NFT, maybe they want to take out a loan, submit a stablecoin payment, all sorts of things. They will submit transactions down to this big old muscular beefy sequencer. And that sequencer will take all the transactions from these little MetaMasks, it'll combine them, it'll aggregate them, it'll send them down to the rollup. The rollup will like, you know, hold on to them, then it'll send it through the bridge. You know, the guard dog will say like these transactions are good, it'll go down to Ethereum, and that's like generally how an L2 works. But how does this model change for a sovereign rollup? And I'm going to start off by going through like what I thought a sovereign rollup worked and how I thought it kind of functioned. In my mind, sovereign rollups, they start with like like my mental model of it started with the L2 model and then tried to build on top of that to get to what a sovereign rollup is. So this is just going to describe how I thought a sovereign rollup worked, how I imagine some of you might think sovereign rollups work as well. So let's go back to this image we have of the L2. So for sovereign rollup, first things first, we don't really need this big old bridge. You know, sovereign rollups are sovereign. You don't need to send everything down to the L2 or to L1. So replace this big bridge with like, I don't know, like a smaller bridge. You know, like you don't really need to send as much stuff onto it. You probably need to send some stuff, but it's not really clear, at least in my mind, what exactly was being sent. And I think there is some sort of validation, or I knew there was some kind of validation going on, but it's not quite the same as like a ZK or optimistic type bridge. So maybe there's some sort of like guard cat. Wasn't really sure, honestly, what exactly this bridge looked like, but I knew that there was something like this for a sovereign rollup. I also know sovereign rollups have like DA layers. You know, there's like Celestia involved. Truthfully, I knew like it's some kind, like, you know, you store your data there. Wasn't really sure how it ties into the rest of the ecosystem. So in my mind, it's like, you know, I have some writing to Celestia. I know Celestia is like really fast and cheap and cool. And so by writing your data there, your blockchain is now also cheap and fast and cool. And you can say you're a modular project now, which is, like, your marketing department really likes it. But like, truthfully, I like didn't really understand how this ties into the rest of this picture, or like what part of the stack really interjects. And then I also know sovereign rollups are sovereign. They have to make their own choices, and so they're allowed to fork. Not really sure where the forking fits into this picture. So in my mind, there's just like this random button on the blockchain you can press called fork that like changes the blockchain state. Wasn't really obvious to me, and it might not be for you as well. Like how dangerous forking is it like value destructive? Is it easy? Is it just like changing the code? Is it like some social consensus? Does all the value on the blockchain kind of collapse after you fork, like ETH classic kind of thing? I know it's like possible for sovereign rollups, wasn't really sure. So in my mind, this is like kind of the picture I had for how sovereign rollups worked. Importantly, this is not correct. This is not at all how sovereign rollups work, and this should not be the model that you use for sovereign rollups. But it was, at least for myself, the model I was using. So maybe let's go into what the right model is for a sovereign rollup and how we should think about them and how they differ from conventional L2s. So let's start with just very basic, what is a rollup in general? And it's not like a smart contract rollup versus a sovereign rollup. It's just like, what is broadly a rollup? This is going to be taken mainly from the talk I talked about earlier from Kelvin. So shout out to him. So a rollup starts off with just an ordered set of transactions, ordered list of transactions. So you have, transactions 1, 2, 3, 4, and n plus 1, et cetera. Making that list of inputs, transactions, that process is called consensus. This is where all rollups kind of start. They define this list of inputs. Then they process those inputs with some set of code. This is called execution. For almost all rollups today, this process is like the EVM. So you have some inputs, some transactions, you process them with some code, for example, the Ethereum state machine, and then as a result, you get some sort of output, output 1, 2, 3, et cetera. This whole process of going inputs, code to outputs, we call these output settlement traditionally, or like when you finalize a set of outputs, this is all a rollup is. And all rollups have this basic structure, and then they basically differ on how exactly they construct the inputs, what kind of execution environment they use, and how exactly they decide what the outputs are. But all rollups fit into this like broad framework. So then, given this framework, where exactly do sovereign rollups fit in? And I think really what we should be focusing on is on this execution and settlement layer on sovereign rollups. And that's really where they differ very dramatically from ETH-L2s. So what exactly, like how exactly do they differ? And what do sovereign rollups do on the execution layer and the settlement layer? And really, at a very high level, sovereign rollups, the nodes in the sovereign rollup itself, those will define the execution and settlement on the rollup. So let's say I have like a sovereign rollup, like Forma is one that launched a couple weeks ago. Forma is like an NFT marketplace. It has a bunch of different nodes. When we say it's sovereign, I mean that those nodes themselves, that is where the execution and the settlement lives. We'll dig into this a little bit more shortly, but that's like how you should start thinking about this. Importantly though, those nodes, anyone can run a node in a sovereign rollup, and all the nodes are kind of equally important. Whereas you think of like an ETH-L2, there's like some nodes that are more important, like the nodes that connect to the sequencer, for example. Sovereign rollup, all the nodes are like, anyone can run them, it's permissionless, and those nodes themselves really truly are the network. And the community, or the set of people running those nodes, they collectively decide what the properties are of that network. So if all the nodes, for example, are like, hey, we actually don't like these rules, want a different rule, that's what makes them sovereign. They can choose their own execution stack or their own settlement stack, and it's not defined by some external party. So when we think about sovereign rollups versus like an ETH-L2, there's main difference we should keep in our mind is who defines execution and who defines settlement. So for sovereign rollup, the nodes themselves define execution settlement. I know I'm saying this a lot, but I think it's somewhat of a novel concept that hasn't really existed before. Whereas for ETH-L2, the way that you define who is executing or who settles is the L1 itself. So let's take base. There's a smart contract on Ethereum. That smart contract literally owns settlement and execution. And what we mean by that is, let's say the nodes and the smart contract differ on what is settled. So let's say I have a base node, it says I have 100 ETH, and then I have the smart contract that says I actually have 10 ETH. The smart contract wins always. There's no way for the nodes to override the smart contract. The smart contract gets to determine what the ground truth is. Whereas for a sovereign rollup, whatever the nodes say is right, that is right. Like that is the true state of the world. It's what we've agreed upon. Maybe tying this back to this earlier image of the world. So this is a smart contract rollup. Like we talked about before, we have users, sequencer, network, bridge, and Ethereum itself. And what we mean by Ethereum is kind of like, it defines where execution settlement is we've canonicalized this bridge. The bridge has all the power here. And the bridge gets to define what the rollup itself is. I'm taking this example from earlier. If there's ever any disagreement in this whole like image on like people at different states of the world, or they think something is true and something like they differ on like what transactions were submitted or anything like that, you always default to this bridge, like in particular the smart contract side of that bridge, and that gets to determine the state for everyone else. So is maybe like somewhat obvious for a regular L2 because we've used L2s. We know you see on like your block explorer when you submit a transaction on base, it's like it's got like that little gray pending thing until it gets settled back down to the L1. It's like we're all pretty familiar with this. But then how does this work on a sovereign rollup? So let's reconstruct this picture for a sovereign rollup. So you have one node, you have your base chain. You have like some node there. But in a sovereign rollup, you really don't have one node. You have many nodes. And importantly, you really do need all these nodes. This network is one basically collective unit in a sovereign rollup. And it's important for them to all have sort of like joint structure. So you have all these nodes. Then you have some apps as well. Like again, running on the nodes, you have like Uniswap, Aave, whatever you want to have. But now these nodes themselves, they get to define everything about the rollup. And so we canonicalize them. They're the ones who decide the ground truth of the world. And importantly, at this point in time, we don't have any other blockchains. Like there's no bridge connecting it to anything else. There's no DA layer. There's nothing else really. And the reason for that is these nodes get to define all those other rules. Like they're where the ground power lies. So these nodes can decide, for example, they want to use like an S3 bucket as data availability, or they want to use any other part of the stack. They have that freedom. No one else can override that power to them. Typically, though, for sovereign rollups today, you do have a bridge to a DA layer. So let's take Celestia. So this sovereign rollup, you have these nodes. They agree that anytime they have a transaction, they post it on this kind of like semi-industrial bridge over to Celestia. And then they all agree that only after the transactions are on Celestia that they can kind of process those transactions from that point onwards. But want to really keep in mind, the power doesn't lie in this bridge, it lies with these nodes. So these nodes can choose to like change that bridge. They can say instead of Celestia, we actually want to use EigenDA later, or we want to use some other DA layer, or we want to use an S3 bucket, whatever. These nodes really can define what the rules are they want to use. But this network, it's nice, but it's not that useful because there's no other blockchains that are really connected to. So let's say we have these other blockchains that we like. We have Ethereum, Bitcoin, Solana, et cetera. And we want to get those tokens over to our sovereign rollup. We can totally normally construct bridges from any other network to our sovereign rollup in the same way you can any other chain. But importantly, these bridges aren't canonicalized on the L1, and they don't really control settlement or execution. They do, like each bridge, let's take the Bitcoin bridge, that Bitcoin bridge is in charge of all the Bitcoin on that network, and it kind of gets to determine like who owns that Bitcoin, but it doesn't get to determine anything else about this network. And you can, like for example, upgrade a bridge. So say Ethereum bridge, you now went from like a 4 out of 5 multisig to like a 10 out of 15 multisig or something. That's totally fine. You can upgrade that bridge, and it changes the properties of ETH on this network, but it doesn't change anything else about the sovereign rollup, like execution or settlement. Maybe digging into this a little more and trying to like ask some like more guiding questions to see to kind of probe around understanding how is our sovereign rollups different from L2s? Is Venmo a sovereign rollup? Let's go back to that. And then does this matter? Like I feel like in crypto we often over-intellectualize things. We kind of make these small differences or kind of very technical differences, but does it actually affect users or communities in any meaningful way? So digging into this, how is it different from ETH L2? We've already kind of talked about this at length, but it's ownership over the settlement execution. Sovereign rollup owns its own execution settlement. ETH L2s, they don't. It's fully owned by Ethereum. And one way to kind of really bring home the point here is ETH L2s have exit hatches. And this is something where the sovereign rollup can never override the exit hatch. That's because the Ethereum L2 has the power, or it controls where settlement is. So let's take, for example, a user who wants to exit Base network. They don't need to at all care about the nodes on Base. They just submit a transaction down to the smart contract on Ethereum, and then that will exit them from that network. And there's nothing else they really need to do because that contract controls all the power. So they don't need Rollups permission. They only need the permission of the smart contract to exit. I've seen people talk about this at length online, though, around why can't L2s just fork and ignore the exit hatch? What really is canonicalizing that exit hatch? And I think this actually is a very good question. Theoretically, it is possible for an L2, like an ETH L2, to maybe fork and just say, I'm not going to care about the exit hatch. So why can't they do this? I think that there's one core reason. This is such a core part of the blockchain itself, the settlement execution layer. By overriding it, you really destroy a lot of the fundamental value of that blockchain. Importantly, for ETH L2, if you ignore the exit hatch, all the ETH in that chain is no longer respected by the ETH L1, and all that value basically becomes destroyed. The blockchain is free to do this, but it basically now is severing ties with its settlement execution layer, which is where almost all the value derives from. So it's, in practice, not really possible for any sort of L2 to fork in such a way where you don't respect exahash, or you want to change the rules in such a way where Ethereum doesn't want you to have that rule change. Okay, now maybe going back to the question from the very beginning of the talk, is Venmo a sovereign rollup? So talked about this a little bit. There's 4 core parts of most blockchains, and sovereign rollups. Sovereign rollups own their own settlement execution. For Venmo, it does have all of these. There is a sequencing aspect of Venmo. There are Venmo servers. They'll order transactions, like I'm trying to send my friend $1, friend's trying to send someone else $2. It'll order those transactions. It does make the data available. There's an API and a UI. You can go observe this data. It's accessible to anyone. There is execution. There is some type of, I want to send my friend $1. There is some state transition that happens. I have one less dollar, they have one more dollar. It's a totally valid state machine. And there is settlement. Whatever Venmo Limited, the company says, that's how many dollars you own. That's how many dollars you owe on Venmo. There is a time when that transaction is settled and finalized. So it has all these kind of components, and in some sense, it's sovereign. Venmo doesn't care about what Ethereum says its state should be. They can define their own state. But I'd say Venmo is not a sovereign rollup. And importantly, it misses 2 very key properties. So it is indeed a ledger. We just described all these things, it defines a ledger. But it is not a permissionless network, and not everyone can join as nodes. So if I want to join the Venmo network to kind of just observe data, it's not possible. It's gated through the Venmo servers. And even more importantly, nodes can't fork. So if all the users of Venmo were I really don't like these rules, I think we should have different ways to send money, or I want to add this extra feature onto Venmo. Let's say all the users want some way to split bills in Venmo or some other feature. They can't go do that. The users can't decide, I'm going to fork and make my own feature. It's totally impossible under the structure. But for sovereign rollups, if the users all want something, they don't like their current network, they can, as nodes, they can just fork that network away. And there's no one stopping them. I think this is really what prevents Venmo from qualifying as sovereign rollup. Okay, last question here. Does it matter if a chain's a sovereign rollup or an L2? And I think it does quite a bit. Mainly sovereign, it's in the name. Sovereign rollups have freedom. They can choose their own future. They can change their own rules at any point in time. For example, they can extend the EVM later. They can switch to an SVM. They can add additional types of rules. They can make gas changes, whatever they want. They have full freedom to change that layer of their stack. Whereas a regular ETH2 does not have that freedom. It has to go down to the smart contract on the Ethereum layer to make those sort of changes. Also, you can fork, very similar. The way I would think about a sovereign rollup is very similar properties to a sovereign blockchain, like a Cosmos SDK chain or some other SDK built chain, but it's much simpler to launch. You don't need a validator set. You don't need a token. You really just need a few pieces of software and a few computers that agree on some state. You need nothing else really. You don't need to pay anyone. You just need people to run nodes. Let's go through maybe some examples of sovereign rollups and how they might be different from L2s. So first, you might imagine you have NFT holders that take slots. Big Celestia NFT project. They can make a chain where only slots can transact on the network, and then they can later. Actually, now I also want baby slots to be able to transact on this network. You might want to change those rules. Totally possible and very easy to do with the sovereign blockchain. You might imagine you have some MMO like RuneScape or something where they have their own in-game currency. They want to build out a more fully functioning economy, but controlled by the users, not controlled maybe by RuneScape itself. That could be a sovereign blockchain. Super easy to make. They can control that currency. They have some way to tie that back into the base game itself. But the currency can be a fully functioning economy. You can also, another example, maybe a little bit more wonky, but co-ops often allocate resources. Those resources can be allocated on a sovereign blockchain. There's a really good paper by Paul Krugman called The Babysitter Co-op, or Babysitter Economy. Really recommend you all check it out. Super interesting paper. And I think actually it does tie in. It gives a good example of a case where sovereign blockchains would enable an economy to function much more elegantly. Okay, that is all. Last thing I want to say. If you are thinking about launching a rollup, please reach out to us at rollup@stridelabs.co. We've been doing a lot of work on rollups and talking to people who are making rollups and thinking about how we can make it easier for folks to build a rollup. We have a TIA bridge as a service for rollups. So if you're all thinking of making a Celestia rollup, a big problem is how do you actually get TIA onto that rollup? We've talked to 4 or 5 different teams building rollups, and this is a problem everyone has. We just offer this now as a free service. So if you need a safe, secure, scalable bridge to get TIA onto your rollup, reach out to us. We'll run it for you, all the info, et cetera. Forma, which is the first Celestia sovereign blockchain, launched about a few weeks ago. Stride runs the canonical TIA bridge to Forma. We're going to do that pretty soon for a few other blockchains, so please reach out to us. Thanks so much for your time.